The heavy glass door of the private club didn't just open, it allowed a sliver of the chaotic outside world to bleed into Jae-young-ji's sterile sanctuary. Jae-young didn't look up from his ledger until the silence of the room changed, not with a bang, but with the rhythmic, squeaky scuff of child-sized sneakers on polished marble. No frantic parent followed the boy. No guardian appeared behind his small frame. There was just Eric E. Barger, a 4-year-old child wearing a shirt so vibrantly yellow it looked like a bruise of sunlight against the club's deep mahogany and smoke. He scanned the dim interior with eyes that had learned to calculate danger before learning multiplication tables, navigating the maze of leather chairs and low-lit tables where businessmen sealed deals with handshakes that could ruin lives. Jae-young's lead security detail stepped forward, a shadow in a black suit, intending to intercept the anomaly, but the boss raised a single, manicured hand. He watched the boy bypass the staff with practiced ease, his worn sneakers making no sound against the polished floor as he wove between tables where couples whispered over candlelight. Jae-young set his fountain pen down with deliberate precision, the soft click echoing in his corner of the lounge. He had chosen this table for its strategic position, back to the wall, clear view of all entrances. But tonight, those predatory instincts served a different purpose as he tracked the child's determined approach. Other diners hadn't noticed yet, too absorbed in their own carefully constructed worlds of luxury and privilege. A woman laughed while adjusting diamond earrings. An elderly couple shared dessert in comfortable silence. And in the corner, a pianist transitioned into something melancholic that matched the sound of the city rain. Eric stopped at the table without invitation, his small hands clutching a blue fabric pouch that bulged with the weight of unseen treasures. He didn't look around nervously or second-guess his choice. Children who lived with monsters learned not to waste time on hesitation. Jae-young observed him with the same intensity he brought to negotiations where millions changed hands, noting the simple, messy hair and the dirt smudge on the boy's left cheek. The contrast was jarring, the intimidating professional in his crisp, expensive white button-down and high-end metal wristwatch leaning in toward a boy who smelled of laundry detergent and strawberry gum. The man crouched down, his expensive trousers dusting the pavement as he lowered himself to the child's level, showing a rare willingness to submit to the boy's lead. He looked into Eric's soft features, seeing the way the boy's shoulder blades pressed against the thin fabric of his yellow shirt as if wings had been clipped before they could fully form. Eric reached out, cupping his small hand to the man's ear in a gesture that was formal despite his trembling fingers. In that moment, the power dynamic of the Seoul underground inverted. The monster was being sought out by the innocent, and the air between them grew heavy with the weight of a secret only a child would dare to tell a man so powerful. "I brought money," the boy whispered, the soft, trembling request carrying more weight than any death threat Jae-young had ever received. As Eric spoke, he placed the blue-patterned drawstring pouch on the white linen napkin. It landed with a soft thud that carried more weight than its physical presence warranted. A mystery box that made the powerful man wonder what could possibly be inside. "Will you protect my mom?" The question hung in the air, a high-stakes plea for protection against a personal monster offered to a man who lived his life in the global shadows. Jae-young's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his dark eyes, a door opening to a room he had locked years ago, a room filled with the same fear this child was now offering up for sale.
Jae-young-ji remained motionless as the boy stepped back, his expensive white shirt a stark contrast to the small, blue-patterned pouch resting on the table. The club was still, the usual hum of high-stakes deals fading into the background as Jae Young reached out with a hand that had signed off on the ruin of empires. His fingers, calloused and steady, touched the soft fabric of the mystery box Eric had offered as a bounty. With the same intensity he brought to business negotiations where millions changed hands, he loosened the drawstring. The contents didn't spill, they tumbled out with the heavy, uncoordinated rhythm of a child's life savings. There were 3 crumpled $5 bills, a handful of quarters that caught the dim light like tiny shields, and 2 shiny dimes. A single nickel rolled toward the edge of the table before Jae Young stopped it with the tip of his finger. $12.45. The mathematics of desperation were laid out on the mahogany, more significant than any transaction Jae Young had ever managed. Beside the money sat a collection of translucent marbles and a plastic ring, the treasures Eric believed were valuable enough to hire a monster. But it was the last item in the pouch that stopped Jae Young's breath. Tucked beneath the crumpled bills was a small, faded photograph, its edges soft from being held too many times. Jae Young picked it up with the careful movements of someone handling something fragile. It was a candid shot of a woman, Sarah, laughing as she balanced a tray in a sun-drenched diner. The image was old, but the kindness in her eyes was unmistakable. In an instant, the cold armor Jae Young had spent a decade welding shut began to crack. He wasn't looking at a stranger's mother. He was looking at the face of the only person who had treated him like a human being 20 years ago, back when he was a nameless runaway starving on the streets. He remembered the warmth of the bowl of rice she had placed in front of him without asking for a dime, and the way she had looked past his ragged clothes to see the boy underneath. Jae Young looked up, his gaze shifting from the photo to Eric, who stood waiting with the detachment of a witness reporting facts. The boy's light brown hair and soft features were a living echo of the woman in the photograph. The contract was no longer just about a child's plea. It was a debt of mercy that had finally come due. "You said men are coming to the door?" Jae Young said, his voice a low vibration that forced Eric to lean in. He didn't reach for the money. He didn't dismiss the boy with the wave of a hand that made grown men scatter. Instead, he tucked the photograph into his inner breast pocket, right against his heart. "They won't be coming anymore," he continued, his jaw tightening with each word. The monster of the Seoul underground had been hired, but not for the $12 on the table. Eric had paid with the only currency Jae Young still valued, a memory of a time before he became the man others feared. Jae Young signaled to his lead security detail, his eyes hardening into the intimidating professional once more. The era of silence was over. As Eric gathered his marbles, unaware that the photo had changed the trajectory of the city's underworld, Jae Young-ji began calculating distances and timelines with the precision that had built his empire. The shadows were about to move, and they were moving for Sarah. The heavy silence of the lounge seemed to expand as Jae Young-ji felt the weight of the photograph against his chest, the edges of the paper pressing through his white button-down shirt like a phantom limb. As he looked at Eric, the sterile, mahogany-scented air of the club dissolved, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of a Seoul winter 20 years ago. In his mind, he was no longer a man of expensive silence and high-end watches. He was a nameless runaway with cracked lips and a stomach that felt like it was eating itself from the inside out. He remembered the way the neon signs of the district used to blur through the hunger-induced haze. He had been a shadow back then, a variable the city ignored, huddled in an alleyway just blocks from where he now sat as a king. The cold had been a physical weight, pressing him into the grimy concrete until he found himself at the back door of a modest, steam-filled diner. He hadn't intended to beg. He had only wanted to stand near the exhaust vent to feel a moment of stolen warmth. The door had creaked open, and instead of the expected blow or the shout of a manager, there was Sarah. She hadn't looked at him with the professional smile of a waiter or the suspicion of a shopkeeper. She had seen the dirt smudge on his cheek and the way his shoulder blades pressed against his thin jacket, and she had simply stepped aside. "Sit," she had said, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of his life. She didn't ask for his name or his story. She had placed a steaming bowl of white rice and a small dish of spicy pork in front of him, the steam rising like a prayer. It was a transaction that carried no interest and demanded no collateral, a debt of mercy that a younger Jae Young couldn't possibly understand. He had eaten with a desperation that made his hands shake, and when he looked up to thank her, she was already busy refilling coffee for a truck driver, acting as if saving a life was just another part of her shift. She had treated him like a human being when the rest of the world treated him like a stray dog, and that single bowl of rice had been the foundation upon which he built his empire. It was the only time in his life he received something without a hidden cost. The sharp clink of a glass at a nearby table snapped Jae Young back to the present. He looked down at his manicured hands, then at Eric, who still stood by the table in his sunshine yellow shirt, waiting for the monster to speak. The boy was the living legacy of that night at the diner. The bad men Eric described, the ones who smelled of sour cigarettes and made the walls remember things they wanted to forget, were now hunting the woman who had once fed a monster when he was just a boy.
Jae Young leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening as the melancholic piano music in the lounge seemed to deepen in tone. The debt was 2 decades old, and the interest had been compounding in his soul ever since. He realized now that his power, long used for destruction and maintaining his status, finally had a purpose that justified its weight. He wouldn't just scare the monsters in Eric's house, he would dismantle the very ground they stood on. "Eric," Jae Young said, his voice lower than the ambient noise, carrying a gravity that made the boy stand straighter. "Your mother once gave a meal to a boy who had nothing. Today, that boy is paying for the dessert." He reached for his phone, his mind already calculating the distances and timelines of the rival syndicate's operations. The empire was about to awake, and for the first time, it wouldn't be for profit. It would be for a bowl of rice and the woman who had the courage to offer it. The boy had barely vanished through the heavy glass doors before the atmosphere in the lounge shifted from a melancholic stillness to a cold industrial hum. Jae Young-ji did not need to raise his voice. A single sharp nod to his second-in-command was enough to activate the machinery of his empire. Within minutes, the intimidating professional was no longer sitting in a mahogany-scented sanctuary, but was staring at a bank of high-definition monitors in the back of a blacked-out van, positioned strategically 3 blocks away from Sarah's apartment. He watched the grain of the surveillance feed with the same intensity he brought to business negotiations where millions changed hands, his jaw tightening as the digital clock on the screen ticked forward. The apartment building was a crumbling relic of the district, a place where the walls remembered things they wanted to forget, and the hallways smelled of the sour cigarettes Eric had described. Through the long-range lens, Jae Young saw the shadows arrive. They didn't come with the deliberate precision of Jae Young's men. They came with the clumsy, loud arrogance of low-level predators who fed on the vulnerable. 3 men in cheap leather jackets exited a dented sedan, their laughter echoing through the narrow alley as they kicked a stray trash can aside. They moved toward Sarah's door with the entitlement of people who believed they already owned the furniture inside.
Jae-young watched as the lead collector, a man with greasy hair and a voice that seemed to make the very floor shake, pounded on the door. He didn't just knock, he used his shoulder, trying to force the frame to yield. On the secondary screen, a hidden camera placed in the hallway caught a glimpse of Sarah through the peer hole. She looked exactly like the photo in Jae-young's pocket, though the sun-drenched laughter had been replaced by a mask of frozen terror. She was wearing her nurse's uniform, her hands trembling as she checked the deadbolt, trying to maintain the language of silence she had taught her son so he wouldn't realize the war zone they were living in.
"Open up, Sarah. We know the kid is out," the lead collector barked, his voice distorted through the van's speakers. He leaned in close to the wood, his shadow stretching across the hallway like a stain. "Interest doesn't sleep, and neither do we. You want to go to the hospital tonight? We can make sure you arrive as a patient." The other two men laughed, one of them pulling out a heavy metal tool and dragging it across the door's metal plating, a screeching sound that acted as a psychological razor. Jae-young's hands, resting on the console, curled into fists that mirrored his tightening jaw. He watched Sarah retreat into the kitchen, her back against the wall, sliding down until she was small on the floor, breathing through her mouth, just as Eric had described his own nightly ritual in the closet. "Sir, we have clear IDs on all three. They're part of the Park Syndicate's debt collection arm," his lieutenant whispered, waiting for the order to strike. But Jae-young remained motionless, his mind calculating distances and timelines with a lethal accuracy. He wasn't going to just stop this one harassment. He was going to dismantle the entire structure that allowed these men to breathe the same air as the woman who had once shown him mercy. He watched as the collectors finally retreated, leaving a fresh dent in the door and a final notice taped over the peephole, their footsteps fading as they promised to return when the sun went down. Jae-young leaned back, the blue glow of the monitors reflecting off his dark neck tattoo. The ghost transaction had already begun in his head. He didn't need guns for what came next. He needed to turn the hunters into the hunted. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over a contact that would trigger a financial guillotine. "Don't touch them yet," Jae-young commanded, his voice a low vibration that froze the man in the van. "I want them to feel the floor shaking under their own feet first. I want them to realize that the nobody they've been hunting is actually the ward of a monster." The air inside the command van was thick with the scent of ozone and the quiet, rhythmic tapping of keys as the surveillance team processed data. Jae-young sat in the center of the artificial glow, his dark neck tattoo catching the blue light of the monitors like an ink-stained warning. He remained motionless, his mind calculating distances and timelines with the precision that had built his empire. Behind him, his inner circle, the men who had bled beside him to secure the district, exchanged glances of mounting confusion. They were used to operations that yielded territory, laundered millions, or silenced rivals. But this calculated pursuit of low-level debt collectors felt like a deviation from the rules they lived by. "Sir," his lieutenant began, his voice hesitant, breaking the heavy silence that Jae-young usually maintained like a fortress. "The Park Syndicate is a minor variable. We could have wiped those three off the street an hour ago without a single drop of blood reaching the papers." He gestured to the screen, where the debt collectors were seen laughing in their dented sedan. "Why are we burning high-level resources on a nobody? She has no standing, no connection to our interests. The underworld doesn't usually move for $12.45.
Jae-young didn't turn around. He watched the screen where Sarah sat on her kitchen floor, her nurse's uniform a pale blur in the dim light of her apartment. The language of silence she used to protect Eric was the same one Jae-young had mastered decades ago, a survival mechanism born from having no other options left to try. His lieutenant saw a woman with a mountain of debt and a child in a sunshine yellow shirt. Jae-young saw the only human being who had ever offered him a transaction that didn't involve a hidden cost. The rules of the underworld are built on debts, are they not? Jae-young's voice was a low vibration, forcing his men to lean in, the same way he had forced Eric to lean in during their secret whisper. He finally turned, his expression one of intense focus that made the air in the van feel suddenly thin. We track every penny moved through the docks. We remember every slight from a rival family. But you think a debt of mercy is the one we are allowed to forget? The lieutenant shifted, the leather of his jacket creaking. It's just the optics, sir. If the other families see the intimidating professional playing guardian to a waitress and a boy with a pouch of marbles, they'll see a crack in the armor. He was worried about the monster losing his teeth, unaware that the choice of what to bite was exactly what gave Jae-young his true power. Jae-young stood, his tall frame nearly brushing the ceiling of the van, the light from the monitors reflecting off his high-end metal wristwatch. He reached into his inner pocket and felt the soft edges of the photograph, the photo of Sarah that had changed the trajectory of the night. "They won't see a crack," Jae-young said, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. "They will see that my reach is so long it can pull a single child out of the dark. They will see that I don't just manage territories, I manage the ghosts that the rest of you have forgotten how to fear." He walked toward the door of the van, the motion deliberate and calculated. "The woman is not a nobody. She is the holder of the only debt I have ever felt the need to pay in full." He paused at the exit, looking back at the screens. The park syndicate thinks they are hunting a vulnerable woman. They don't realize they have walked into a war zone that happened 20 years ago, and tonight I am closing the circle. The inner circle fell silent, the weight of his convictions settling over them like the soft thud of Eric's pouch on the linen napkin. They realized then that this wasn't a distraction from the business, it was the most personal business Jae-young had ever conducted. The blue glow of the surveillance monitors reflected off Jae-young's high-end metal wristwatch as he began the ghost transaction, a maneuver that required no bullets, only the cold, clinical application of his empire's resources. He remained motionless in the back of the van, his mind calculating distances and timelines with the precision that had made him the most feared man in the district. To the men of the park syndicate, power was a loud, blunt instrument, a fist against a door, or a threat shouted in a hallway. To Jae-young, power was a silent, invisible tide that could pull the ground out from under a man before he even realized he was sinking. He began by repurposing the machinery of his financial network. With a few sharp commands to his digital team, Jae-young didn't just target the collectors, he targeted the air they breathed. The park syndicate operated on a web of high-interest loans, back-alley credit lines, and laundered storefronts. Jae-young's team moved through the digital underbelly of the city like ghosts, identifying every scrap of paper the rival crew owed to larger, more dangerous entities. He wasn't just observing the debt, he was buying it. One by one, the shadows became the subjects of their own nightmare. The lead collector, the man who had pounded on Sarah's door with such arrogant entitlement, was currently sitting in his dented sedan, unaware that his car loan had just been bought by a shell company owned by Jae-young. His apartment lease followed. Even the tiny, crooked gambling debt he owed to a local parlor was swept up into Jae-young's growing portfolio. The hunters were being meticulously converted into assets on a ledger, their lives now owned by the man they were unwittingly insulting. Jae-young watched the screens as the shift in the atmosphere began to manifest in the physical world. The lead collector's phone buzzed, a final notice from a bank he didn't recognize. Then a call from his landlord. The arrogant laughter in the sedan died a slow, agonizing death as the three men realized that suddenly they were the ones whose floors were shaking. They were being hunted by a ghost who spoke the language of careful omissions and strategic silences. "They're panicking, sir," his lieutenant whispered, watching the GPS trackers as the collectors began driving erratically from one location to another, desperate to find answers that didn't exist in their world. "They don't understand how the rules changed so fast." Jae-young didn't reach for the blue pouch of marbles, but he felt its presence on the console. $12.45 had been the opening bid in a war the Park Syndicate couldn't afford to fight. By buying their deaths, Jae-young had created a financial guillotine. He now held the power to evict them, repossess their vehicles, and blackball them from every legitimate and illegitimate business in the city with a single keystroke. He watched Sarah through the hallway camera. She was still sitting on her kitchen floor, but the men outside her door were gone, called away by the sudden, inexplicable crumbling of their own lives. She didn't know that the monster Eric had hired was currently dismantling her enemies from a blacked-out van 3 blocks away. All she knew was that for the first time in months, the hallway was silent. Jae-young leaned back, his jaw tightening as he watched the lead collector step out of his car, looking around the street with the frantic, wide-eyed gaze of someone who finally understands they are being watched. The ghost transaction was nearly complete. He had turned their world into a cage, and now he was ready to step out of the shadows and show them the face of the man who held the key.
"Prepare the car," Jae-young commanded, his voice a low vibration that carried the finality of a closing door. "I want to meet the man who thinks Sarah is a nobody. I want to see his face when he realizes he's been trying to collect from a ghost." The meeting was set in a desolate, rain-slicked shipyard, a place where the city's industrial skeleton met the dark water of the Han River. Jae-young stepped out of the black sedan with a deliberate, haunting precision, his silhouette a sharp contrast to the rusted cranes and skeletal warehouses. He adjusted the cuff of his crisp white shirt, the metal of his wristwatch catching the dim, flickering light of a nearby street lamp. Across the perimeter stood Director Park, the head of the syndicate that had been terrorizing Sarah. Park was a white-collar professional in a tailored suit who preferred to hide his brutality behind legal jargon and interest rates, but his expensive exterior was currently fraying at the edges as his phone vibrated incessantly with reports of his empire's sudden, systematic collapse. Jae-young didn't wait for an introduction. He walked into the center of the clearing, his dark neck tattoo serving as a visceral anchor for Park's eyes. It was a visual collision of two worlds, the man who looked like a monster but acted with a strange hidden code, and the man who looked like a gentleman but fed on the desperate. The air between them grew heavy, the tension building like a storm gathering strength. Jae-young's presence was a physical weight that forced the rival leader to stand straighter, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of the same calculation Eric had shown in the lounge. Only Park's calculation was born of fear, not survival. "You've been busy, Director G," began Park, his voice thin and strained as he tried to maintain the professional smile of a man still in control. "My collectors are being evicted. My credit lines are being frozen by banks I've used for a decade. All for a waitress with a delinquent account? It's bad business. It's an emotional variable in a world that doesn't allow for them." Jae-young stopped 5 paces away, his jaw tightening incrementally. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply leaned forward slightly, bringing the intimidating professional into Park's personal space. Bad business is hunting a woman who once fed a man who remembers what it feels like to be hungry. Jae-young's voice was a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to make the very ground beneath Park's polished shoes feel unstable. "You see a waitress. I see a debt that has been compounding for 20 years, and today I am the one collecting."
Park tried to scoff, but the sound died in his throat as Jae-young pulled a single sheet of paper from his pocket, the consolidated deed to Park's primary headquarters, purchased through the Ghost transaction just an hour prior. "You think you own her life because of a signature on a loan." Jae-young's gaze was as cold and clinical as the monitors in the van. "But I own the roof over your head, the car you drove here, and the very air you're currently wasting. You aren't here to negotiate, Director. You're here to sign a release." The silence that followed was melancholic and inevitable, broken only by the sound of the rain hitting the metal containers. Jae-young watched as the realization settled into Park's eyes, the understanding that he was no longer the hunter, but a variable that had been meticulously solved and discarded. The white-collar leader looked down at the paper, then back at the man with the dark tattoo, seeing the monster that Eric had hired. Jae-young's intensity was unwavering. He was a man who understood the language of fear because he had been raised by it, and now he was using it to protect a sanctuary he hadn't known he still possessed.
"Sign it," Jae-young commanded, the single word carrying the finality of a closing grave. "And if your men so much as breathe the scent of sour cigarettes near that apartment again, I won't use a pen to settle the next account." With trembling fingers, Park signed the release, forfeiting the debt and Sarah's future in one desperate stroke. Jae-young took the paper back with the careful movements of someone handling something fragile. He had won the war without a single drop of blood being spilled, proving that his power could be a shield just as easily as it had been a sword. As he turned back toward his car, the melancholic weight in his chest seemed to lift, replaced by a strange, quiet peace. He had moved the shadows, and for the first time, he was walking toward the light Eric had brought into his world. The shipyard fell into a chilling, absolute silence as Director Park and his remaining men retreated into the rain, their taillights disappearing like fading embers into the soul fog. Jae-young stood alone for a moment, the signed release in his hand vibrating slightly in the wind. He didn't feel the victory of a conquered territory or the adrenaline of a successful hit. Instead, he felt the quiet, steady rhythm of a circle finally beginning to close. By the time he reached his car, the machinery of his empire was already executing the final phase of the cleanup. The rival crew wasn't just losing a debt, they were being erased from the city's infrastructure. Phone lines were cut, leases were terminated, and by dawn, the men who smelled of sour cigarettes would be nothing more than ghosts on a bus headed toward the border, warned by voices they didn't dare ignore that the district was now hallowed ground. As the sun began to bleed through the gray morning clouds, a different kind of silence settled over the apartment complex where Sarah lived. The heavy, rhythmic pounding on the door that had defined her nights for months did not come. There was no shouting, no shaking of the floorboards, no sound of metal scraping against the frame. Instead, at exactly 7 a.m., the same time Eric usually sat in the closet with his pillow over his head, a soft, professional rustle came from the hallway. Sarah approached the door with the practiced caution of someone expecting a blow. She looked through the peephole, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the hallway was empty. The shadows had vanished. Taped to the wood, right over the dent the lead collector had left the night before, was a crisp, cream-colored envelope. It bore no return address and no seal, just her name written in a precise, elegant hand. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the envelope inside. She sat at the small kitchen table, the same place where she had sliding down in terror only hours earlier, and pulled out a single sheet of heavy bond paper. At the top, in cold legal type, were the words "Release of liability" and "Full satisfaction of debt." Her eyes blurred as she scanned the document. Her account, the one that had felt like a mountain of glass she was forced to climb every day, was marked with a stamp that felt heavier than the paper itself. Paid in full. There was no signature from a bank, no name of a benefactor, just a small, hand-drawn symbol at the bottom of the page, a tiny, translucent circle that looked remarkably like a marble. Sarah let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 20 years. The language of silence that had been her prison was suddenly transformed into a sanctuary of peace. She looked toward the hallway where Eric's bedroom door was cracked open. The boy was standing there, still in his yellow shirt, watching her with eyes that were far too old for his face. He didn't ask what was in the letter. He didn't ask if the bad men were gone. He simply saw the way his mother's shoulders finally dropped, the way the light from the window caught the tears on her cheeks, and he knew. Outside, blocks away, Jae-young-ji watched the apartment building from the window of his sedan. He didn't need to see her face to know the burden had been lifted. He could feel the shift in the city's equilibrium. He reached into his pocket and felt the empty space where the photo had been, and then he touched the small blue fabric pouch he had kept from the table. The $12.45 were gone, distributed to the men who had handled the digital logistics, but the marbles remained. "The account is settled," he whispered to the empty car, his voice a low vibration that carried no threat, only a quiet, melancholic grace. The monster of the Seoul Underground had fulfilled his contract, and for the first time in his life, Jae-young-ji realized that the most powerful thing he had ever owned wasn't a territory or a syndicate. It was the ability to ensure that a child in a sunshine yellow shirt would never have to learn how to hide in a closet again. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain-washed pavement and the distant rhythmic hum of a city waking up without its usual weight. Eric stood on the sidewalk outside the local grocery store, his small hand tucked safely into his mother's. Sarah looked different today. The invisible wire that had kept her shoulders tight for months had snapped, replaced by a softness in her gaze as she hummed a quiet melody while checking her shopping list. She felt the peace of the paid-in-full notice, but she didn't know the face of the ghost who had signed it. Eric, however, was still a child who lived in the world of secrets, and he knew that every miracle required a merchant. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb a half-block away, idling with the low, predatory purr of a sleeping beast. The tinted windows were opaque, reflecting the gray skyline and the bright, persistent yellow of Eric's shirt. Most people walked past the vehicle with their heads down, sensing the intimidating professional aura that clung to the car like a frost. But Eric didn't look away. He stopped walking, causing his mother to pause and look down at him with a questioning smile. "Just a second, Mama," he whispered, his eyes locked on the car's rear window. Inside the climate-controlled silence of the sedan, Jae-young-ji watched the boy through the one-way glass. He was back in his world of expensive silence, his dark neck tattoo partially obscured by the high collar of a new charcoal overcoat. He looked at the boy and the woman who had once saved him with a bowl of rice, and the boy who had saved him with a pouch of marbles. He watched the way Sarah laughed at something Eric said, a sound he couldn't hear but could see in the tilt of her head and the brightness of her eyes. The monster of the Seoul Underground remained motionless, a sentinel in a metal suit, ensuring that the sanctuary he had built with a financial guillotine remained undisturbed.
Then Eric did it. With the solemn gravity of a businessman concluding a lifetime deal, the boy raised his hand. It wasn't a frantic, childish wave, but a slow, deliberate movement, a small palm held open toward the black glass. It was a signal of recognition, an acknowledgement that the contract had been fulfilled and the monsters had been scared away for good. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The car sat like a stone in the river of pedestrian traffic. Then, the rear window eased down just an inch, enough for the shadows inside to shift. Jae-young leaned forward into the sliver of light, his sharp jawline and groomed goatee momentarily visible. He didn't smile. Men like Jae-young had forgotten how to use their faces for warmth. Instead, he gave a single, slow nod, a king acknowledging a peer. It was a silent pact, a promise that the secret of the blue pouch would stay between the two of them, a hidden foundation upon which Eric's new, safe life would be built. "Who are you waving at, sweetie?" Sarah asked, shielding her eyes to look toward the car. "Just a friend, Mama," Eric said, his voice steady and practiced. "He helps people." The window slid back up with a soft mechanical hiss, sealing the secret guardian back into his world of shadows. The sedan pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic with the same calculated precision Jae-young brought to everything he touched. As the car vanished around the corner, Eric felt the weight of a single translucent marble in his pocket, the one Jae-young had insisted he keep. He squeezed it tight, a small piece of treasure that proved, even in a city of monsters, some teeth were only meant to protect. The district returned to its usual rhythm, a world of sharp suits and cold transactions, but inside the glass-walled office at the summit of the G Empire, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Jae-young Ji sat behind his desk, a monolith of black obsidian that usually held nothing but encrypted tablets and high-stakes contracts. The intimidating professional was back in his element, his dark hair slicked back and his white shirt pristine, yet his eyes remained fixed on a small, incongruous object resting in the center of the desk's vast emptiness. It was a single, translucent marble. It was a swirls of cobalt and white, trapped in glass, a relic from the blue-patterned pouch that had arrived like a miracle in a child's hand.
To anyone else, it was a toy, a worthless variable in a room where billions were managed. But to Jae-young, it was the most significant asset he had ever acquired. It was the physical receipt for a debt of mercy he had carried for 20 years, a reminder that the world wasn't just made of predators and prey, but of small, quiet moments of humanity that could stay a monster's hand. He reached out, his thumb grazing the cool, curved surface of the glass. He remembered the weight of the pouch on the linen napkin, the soft thud that had carried more gravity than a vault full of gold. His phone buzzed, a notification regarding a multi-million-dollar acquisition in the shipping sector. He ignored it. For the first time in his career, the numbers didn't seem to add up to anything that mattered. His mind drifted to the paid-in-full notice and the way Sarah had looked in the morning sun, her shoulders finally free of the burden he had helped dismantle. He thought of Eric, the boy in the sunshine yellow shirt who had been brave enough to hire a king with the contents of a toy box. Jae-young realized then that his power had finally found its equilibrium. He had spent a decade building a fortress of fear, believing that his only value was in the shadows he could cast. But the marble represented a different kind of strength, the strength to protect, to heal, and to honor a bowl of rice given to a starving boy who had no way to pay it back. He wasn't just a man people feared anymore. He was a silent guardian, a merchant of hope, who had traded a city's worth of influence for a child's peace of mind. He picked up the marble and held it against the light of the window, watching the cobalt swirls dance. It was a treasure in the truest sense of the word. He thought of his highest-paying client, a 5-year-old with a steady voice and a blue pouch, and a rare, almost imperceptible softening touched the corners of his mouth. The door to his office opened and his lieutenant stepped in, ready to brief him on the day's territorial disputes. The man stopped, his eyes darting to the marble on the desk, then back to the intense focus in Jae-young's gaze. He sensed the expensive silence had changed. It was no longer a warning of an impending strike, but the quiet of a man who had finally settled his own internal accounts. "Leave the reports," Jae-young said, his voice a low vibration that carried a new kind of authority, one that didn't need to shout to be heard. "Today, we aren't looking for profit. We're looking for debts of mercy that have gone unpaid." He placed the marble back in the center of the obsidian desk. It remained there,
a spot of color against the darkness, a reminder that while the world might be run by monsters, even the most feared among them could be moved by the courage of a child and the weight of a single, beautiful wish. The circle was closed, the wound was healed, and for Jae Young-ji, the value of treasure had finally been defined.